Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Grave Mist. Whisper. Now, I know many of you listen to these stories late at night, sometimes drifting off while the wind hits your window. But before you get too comfortable, let me ask you something. Have you ever been deep enough in the woods that the trees themselves seem to be watching you? Tonight, we'll be venturing into the story of a veteran park ranger who uncovered something impossible, a forest that counts, shifts, and leads wanderers to places that shouldn't exist. These are his journal entries, 10 documented events that reveal what happens when the forest starts keeping score. Before we begin, take a second to comment below where you're listening from. It's always eerie to see just how far these stories travel. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these tales. It truly helps keep them coming. Now dim the lights, and let's begin. Even Rusk had spent 12 years working for the Forestry Service, long enough to know that most so-called mysteries of the woods had explanations. A sound at night was wind through the hollows. Footprints that appeared and vanished were from elk who walked backward in confusion. The forest didn't play tricks. People just didn't listen right. But the new posting felt different from the beginning. He arrived at North Canyon Outpost after a week of storms that had chewed entire trails into rivers of mud. The place looked like a set piece from another decade. One cabin, one metal shed, and a rusted radio tower that hadn't buzzed properly in years. The last ranger on record had transferred out mid-season and left no final report. Only a logbook that ended mid-sentence. The regional office's orders were simple. Repaint the old evacuation markers. Verify GPS coordinates for safety maps. Do not deviate from assigned paths. He read the memo twice, folded it neatly, and pinned it to the corkboard above the desk. Evan had always liked simple work, a steady rhythm, something you could count. He packed the next morning before dawn. Compass, field radio, 2 flares, an old .22 sidearm, and a can of bright orange paint. He liked to start early, when fog still hung low and the forest smelled like iron and wet moss. He followed the first segment of Trail 19, where a recent landslide had stripped the hillside raw. Fallen trunks were splintered and half-buried, their roots jutting up like broken ribs. The first few markers were easy. He brushed away debris, repainted each number, and logged its coordinate, 001, 002, 003. He spoke the numbers aloud as he worked, an old habit from night patrols. Counting kept him grounded. By mid-morning, sunlight had broken through the canopy, turning the wet leaves into mirrors. He reached markers 050 by noon, 063 by late afternoon. That's when he noticed it. The woods were too quiet. Not the natural hush that comes before rain, but a vacuum, like sound itself had been drained away. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind in the fir needles. Only his own breathing and the soft click of his brush against bark. He told himself the wildlife had moved deeper after the storm, logical, routine. But when he turned back toward the cabin, something caught his eye. The painted numbers glowed faintly in the dimming light, a wet orange shimmer under fog. From where he stood, the line of trees formed a slow, perfect curve deeper into the forest, bending slightly left. That shouldn't have been possible. The markers were supposed to follow a straight path down the ridge. He checked his compass. It spun twice before settling north. His GPS froze. No signal. He sighed and wrote the note into his logbook anyway. Trail 19, Day 1. Markers up to 063 complete. Terrain unstable. Compass interference noted. Local wildlife absent. Trail curvature inconsistent with map data. He looked up once more at the faint orange marks glowing between the trees. The curve had shifted again, almost imperceptibly, like the forest had breathed. He capped the paint, slung the brush over his shoulder, and said softly into the silence, "All right then." Let's see where you want me to go. Evan woke before dawn, long before the fog lifted from the valley floor. The cabin walls creaked softly with the temperature drop, and somewhere outside, a branch tapped against the tin roof in a steady rhythm, not quite random, not quite pattern. He made coffee over the small propane stove and reviewed his notes from the previous day. Trail 19, markers 001, 063, complete. Compass interference. No wildlife. No wind. It looked clinical, almost harmless on paper. He'd even added a dry reminder to himself. Bring more paint. By the time the first pale light bled through the trees, he was already halfway down the path with a new can of orange paint rattling in his pack. He liked the early hours, the hush before birds woke, before the forest began to speak in its usual chorus. Out here, the silence felt heavy, like the air was thick with something waiting to be measured. He set his brush against the next trunk and said the number out loud. 064. The sound of his voice felt swallowed by the trees. He painted the next. 065, and then another. 066. Each mark was crisp and even, same spacing, same height. He worked methodically, the way he'd been trained. Count the distance, step back, check the line of sight, log the coordinate. The rhythm steadied him. 001, 002, 003. The ritual of order in a place that didn't want it. By mid-afternoon, he'd passed 100 markers. His arm ached. The fog had thickened again, curling low across the trail in slow-moving sheets. He paused to drink and check his compass. It spun once, corrected, then flickered north again. That's when he noticed it. The numbers ahead of him, the ones he hadn't painted yet, seemed brighter than the ones behind him. The light wasn't reflection. It was as if each mark held its own faint glow, a pulse almost too soft to see unless he looked straight at it. He stepped closer, to one, and ran his finger over the bark. The paint was dry, rough beneath his glove. Normal. But when he pulled his hand back, there was a faint smear of orange dust, fine as ash. He looked down the trail. The sequence stretched out in perfect rhythm through the fog, like an illuminated spine threading the forest together. 64, 65, 66. Each one glowing a little stronger as the mist thickened. Evan turned off his headlamp to test the effect. Instantly, the woods dimmed to a muted grey, except for the numbered trees. The marks shimmered faintly, almost pulsing. He felt a strange urge to keep counting, even without the brush. Just numbers in his head. 67, 68, 69. By the time he reached the base of the ridge, the forest had gone completely silent again. His watch read 6:03 p.m. He'd been painting for nearly 12 hours. He turned back toward the cabin, but for a moment, the direction looked wrong, like the trail had curved in on itself while he wasn't looking. The glowing numbers formed a faint spiral through the fog, curling deeper into the trees. Evan blinked, counted the last visible one, 081, and whispered to himself, almost as a prayer, "That's enough for today." But the forest didn't agree, because somewhere ahead, unseen, another number answered him, a voice, faint and low, echoing through the mist. 82. Evan didn't sleep much that night. The forest outside the cabin breathed differently after sunset. Long exhalations of fog rolling down from the ridge, filling the hollows like something alive. Every few minutes, the radio on his desk crackled once, as if catching half a signal, then went dead again. He tried to ignore it. He tried to focus on his logbook instead. Markers up to Zotum 81 complete. Paint adhesion good. Trail alignment inconsistent. Possible slope drift. He capped his pen and stared at that last line. Possible slope drift. As if the whole hillside had quietly rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. At dawn, the fog still lingered. Pale grey light filtered through the pines, and his breath came out in little clouds. Evan packed his coffee thermos, a GPS unit, and one fresh can of orange paint. He wasn't superstitious, but he carried his old brush instead of a new one. The ritual mattered now. He reached Trail 19 at 6:20 a.m. The forest was utterly still. Dew clung to every branch. Then he froze. The first marked tree, the one that should have read 081, now said 041. The numbers were crisp, perfectly formed, the same brush pattern as his own. He stepped closer and touched the bark. The paint was dry, days dry. The next tree read 042, the next 043. The numbers continued flawlessly, climbing one by one through the fog. The exact same handwriting, the same orange hue, even the same height on each trunk. His first thought was vandalism. Maybe someone from a nearby station decided to play a prank. But there were no tire tracks, no boot prints, no evidence of anyone else on the trail. He checked his GPS, signal strong, coordinates correct. But the map overlay no longer matched the terrain. The red trail line bent north where it used to go east, veering deeper into uncharted woods. He followed the changed numbers for half a mile before he realized how far he'd gone. The counting didn't stop at 081. It kept going. 125, 137, 149. He reached a narrow stream that hadn't existed on any survey. The new markers crossed it cleanly, each on the far bank already painted. Impossible, he muttered, crouching to inspect the nearest trunk. The brush strokes had depth, tiny ridges where the bristles had dragged. Whoever painted them hadn't just copied his style. They'd used his exact brush. He opened his pack. The brush was still there, still wet from yesterday, sealed inside a rag. The realization hit him slowly, like cold spreading through fabric. The forest wasn't erasing his work. It was continuing it. He set down the brush, took 3 photos with his field camera, and started back toward the cabin. But as he turned, a flicker of orange caught his eye. A fresh mark gleamed on a nearby trunk, 278. He hadn't painted that. He'd never even walked that far. He stared at it, heart thudding, waiting for some logical trick of light to undo what he was seeing. Instead, the faint sound of bristles brushing bark drifted from somewhere behind him, slow, careful, and steady. Someone, or something, was still painting. And it was getting closer. Evan started the morning with a simple rule. If something doesn't make sense, measure it again. He'd spent half the night turning his field camera over in his hands, staring at the photos he'd taken, the ones showing numbers that shouldn't exist. Every one of them was sharp, time-stamped, and real. There was no trick of light, no motion blur. Just hundreds of new orange markers climbing into the mist, continuing his sequence long after he'd stopped painting. At sunrise, he checked his radio. The green light blinked, then faded. Static filled the cabin, faint but constant, like a breath caught on repeat. He adjusted the frequency. Nothing. Just the same low hiss, undercut by something that almost sounded like whispering. Northline dispatch. This is Rusk at Trail 19, he said, holding the mic close. I've got interference and irregular markings, possible vandalism or map error. For a moment, the static deepened. Then it clicked twice, the kind of double pulse that usually meant someone was trying to key in, before fading out entirely. He waited. The silence pressed in around him. By 8 a.m., he was back on the trail. The air smelled of wet pine and old rain. The orange numbers shone faintly even in daylight, leading him forward like breadcrumbs. 279, 280, 281. He logged each one, double-checking coordinates as he walked. But the GPS unit stopped updating after 300. The signal bar blinked red. The terrain was unfamiliar. No creeks where they should have been. No ridgeline in sight. He unfolded the district map from his pack and laid it flat on a boulder. The trail was supposed to run east for 4 more kilometers, then end near an old service road. But his compass needle was trembling north, and every landmark on paper was gone in the real world. He tried the radio again. "Dispatch, confirm coordinates for Trail 19 North Extension." Static. Then, faintly, Evan. He froze. "Say again?" The radio hissed once, then cut off completely. He exhaled, slow. "Fine. I'll finish this by hand." The trees thinned gradually into a wide clearing. The fog clung low, brushing his knees. At the center stood a single wooden post, clean, weathered, and blank. No number, no paint, just raw wood, as if it had been waiting for him. Evan stepped closer. The ground around it was untouched. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. He reached out and brushed the surface with his fingers, smooth and dry. He lifted his brush from his pack almost without thinking. The bristles were still stiff with old orange paint. It felt natural to continue the sequence, one more mark to make it even. But before he could touch the post, the forest went still again, not quiet, still. And then he heard it. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, the sound of bristles dragging against bark. Slow, deliberate, just a few paces away. He turned sharply, paint can in hand, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No figures, no wind. Just the echo of that soft, rhythmic sound, like someone finishing what he started. He took a single step back toward the post. A fresh number gleamed on it now, wet and shining. 00342. He hadn't written it, but it was written in his hand. Evan didn't make a fire that night. The cabin sat too close to the trailhead, and the idea of drawing light, of being seen, felt wrong now. Instead, he set the lantern low on the desk and opened his field log, forcing himself to write the day's report, as if it were any other. Trail 19. Extension confirmed beyond known boundary. Unauthorized markers 279-342 observed. No wildlife, no wind, no sound. He hesitated, then added a final line in smaller handwriting. Paint continued by unknown agent. It looked insane on paper, but he needed it written somewhere, just in case. He closed the ledger, checked the locks twice, and lay down in his cot with the GPS unit still powered beside him. The screen glowed faintly in the dark. A small square of certainty. 047 hours, coordinates steady, no movement. The rain started sometime after midnight. A thin, whispering drizzle that clung to the roof and made the forest hiss softly beyond the walls. Evan drifted between waking and sleep, counting each metallic tick on the stovepipe like it was another tree marker. 340, 341, 342. At 2:11 a.m., the GPS beeped. He blinked awake, heart already racing. The display showed his trail map. Only now, the markers were shifting. One by one, their coordinates began to move. Slowly, deliberately, as if the trees themselves were walking the path. He sat up, wiped condensation off the screen, and watched in disbelief. Each dot, each painted tree, advanced a few meters south, paused, then moved again. The whole line crawled toward the cabin, synchronized like footsteps. He grabbed the radio. Static. No voice. Just a deep, rolling hum beneath the noise. He whispered, "Dispatch, this is Rusk, at Trail 19. I have live movement on static points. Possible seismic activity or..." The hum rose until the cabin's window pane began to vibrate. The lantern flickered once and died. Evan froze, his breath misted in the dark. The generator outside clicked twice before shutting itself off. The GPS dimmed to black. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of rain on the roof and that low vibration, deep as a heartbeat. He reached for his flashlight but stopped halfway. Light suddenly felt like a bad idea, an invitation. Instead, he listened. The forest outside wasn't silent anymore. Something was moving, not fast but steady, like the rhythm of heavy boots on soft ground. The sound came from the trail direction, from the exact path he'd marked. 1 step. Pause. 2 steps. Pause. Closer. He held his breath, straining to hear beyond the blood in his ears. Then faintly, something answered from inside the woods. A noise that wasn't footsteps but something larger. A low vibration, almost musical, humming through the floorboards and walls in slow, pulsing waves. The cabin's nails creaked in their frames. The hum deepened, shaping itself into a cadence that felt familiar. It was counting, not aloud, but through the vibrations themselves. The floor beneath him shuddered once for each beat, a pattern that matched the numbering sequence exactly. 343, 344, 345. He gripped the edge of the desk, eyes wide in the dark, realizing what the forest was doing. It wasn't following the markers. It was reading them. Evan woke to an unnatural stillness. No birds, no wind, no distant rustle of branches, just a thin veil of fog clinging to the windows and a silence that pressed against the cabin walls like a held breath. He checked the clock. 6:03 a.m. The generator had shut off sometime in the night. His GPS lay dark beside the cot, its battery drained even though he'd turned it off before sleeping. He reached for his field journal, the last entry still open. Movement logged, 02:11 a.m. Trail shifting. Counting sound confirmed. He ran a hand over the page. The ink was smeared, the edges damp, like something had breathed over it. Outside, the world glowed faintly silver through the fog. He stepped out with his pack, expecting to see the same line of numbered trees marching down the ridge, orange marks he'd painted, now continuing on their own. But as soon as he reached the first one, he froze. The numbers were wrong. Each marker now bore even numbers only, neat, perfect, and symmetrical. 02, 04, 06. He frowned. No, that's not right. Every single odd number had vanished. Every tree that should have held one was clean, bare bark where orange should have been. The entire trail had rewritten itself overnight. He checked his compass. Steady. The GPS flickered to life for a moment, displaying coordinates that didn't match any known map grid. The device beeped once. Error flashing. Unknown zone. He should have turned back then, but curiosity, that old ranger instinct, pulled him onward. The fog deepened with each step. His boots sank into moss instead of gravel now. The ground had changed beneath him. The forest felt tighter, branches woven closer, the air thick and stale. The even-numbered markers led him deeper into a section of woods he'd never seen. No recorded trails, no human clearing, just old trees standing shoulder to shoulder, their bark scarred with faint grooves like something had once tried to carve its way through. He spoke the next number aloud out of habit. 016. The echo came back from ahead. The same voice, slightly delayed, 016. He froze. It wasn't an echo. It was mimicry. The numbers continued in perfect sequence, leading him down a narrow incline until the trees opened suddenly, the same clearing where he'd found the wooden post days earlier. But this time, the post was gone. In its place stood a cabin. It was small and half-collapsed, roof heavy with moss, a single window gaping black against the pale fog. The boards were warped, but something about its shape made his stomach turn. The proportions were wrongly familiar. He stepped closer, tracing the outline with his eyes. The dimensions were identical to his ranger station. Same window, same door frame, same stovepipe angle. He knelt near the entrance, brushing moss from the wood. Underneath, faint numbers were carved, the same orange hue baked into the grain. 04. 6. The forest had rebuilt the pattern, not on trees this time, but on walls. And somewhere deep inside the cabin, he heard the soft, wet sound of a brush dragging against wood, slow, deliberate, and waiting for him to count the next number. The fog had thickened into a wall by the time Evan reached the cabin. It sat crouched in the hollow like it had grown there, the roof heavy with moss, the door warped at the frame, the window glazed with grime. Every instinct told him this structure didn't belong, that it hadn't been standing here yesterday. He took a slow step closer, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The air smelled like iron and sap, and beneath that faintly, like fresh paint. That's when he saw the number. 7. Painted right in the center of the cabin door. The digits were bold, clean, still glistening in the mist. He froze mid-step. The brushwork was unmistakable. The same slanted 7, the same tight downward curl he always made without thinking. It was his handwriting. He swallowed hard. No. No. That's not possible. He crouched, touching the edge of the door with his gloved fingertips. The paint smeared. Wet. Not just recent. Minutes old. He turned sharply, scanning the tree line. Nothing but pale trunks and the slow drift of fog. The forest didn't move, but the silence around him deepened, pulling tighter until he could hear his own heartbeat. Evan's breath came short. He looked back at the number. His number. The one he would have painted next if the sequence hadn't broken. The trail had ended at 196 the night before. He whispered, "Who finished it?" The question hung in the cold air and came back to him a moment later, softened, stretched, as though the forest itself had tried to form an answer. He stepped back, pulling his field radio from his belt. Static again, low and irregular, pulsing like breath. He turned the dial through every known frequency. Nothing but the sound of faint brushstrokes under the static. He turned the device off. The forest exhaled. A creak echoed behind him, sharp, dry, unmistakable. He spun toward the sound. One of the trees at the clearing's edge had split slightly under tension, a thin crack running through its trunk. Down the center of that crack, a fresh mark shone bright orange, a new number. He backed away slowly, eyes darting between the door and the tree. The two marks matched perfectly, both his hand, both wet. His voice trembled as he said, "Stop it. I'm not painting anymore." The forest didn't stop. Another tree further down groaned. The sound of wet paintbrush bristles dragging across bark carried through the fog, patient and steady. Then another creak, another stroke. He turned in a slow circle. The marks were multiplying, forming a path around him, a spiral of new numbers appearing in sequence. The smell of paint thickened in the damp air. He wiped his glove across his face and found an orange smear on the fabric. His pulse spiked. He looked at his hand. The fingertips of his right glove were coated with fresh paint. He hadn't held a brush since yesterday, and yet the marks kept appearing, all in his hand, all in perfect rhythm. When he finally looked back at the cabin door, the number had changed. It no longer read 197. Now, scrawled over it in the same paint, was a single word. Tilted, rushed, and unmistakably his. count. Evan stood at the cabin's threshold for a long time before stepping inside. The doorway sagged inward, the hinges grown soft with rot, but the smell that met him wasn't decay. It was paper, ink, and the faint metallic tang of lantern oil. Inside, the light was dim and colorless. A single lantern sat on a table near the far wall, its glass fogged with soot. Beside it lay a closed notebook, spine cracked, its pages swollen from damp air. Dust hadn't gathered here. Someone had been writing recently. Evan's breath hitched. The brush in his pack clinked against the metal clasp, echoing far too loud in the small room. He set the pack down and approached the table. The first thing he noticed was the handwriting. A small, neat script that leaned slightly forward, precise and methodical. It was the same way he wrote when filing daily logs. The first page read, "Marked trail, numbers changed, found cabin." He turned the page. Marked trail, numbers changed, found cabin. He flipped through the notebook quickly, pages whispering past his thumb. Every single one, dozens, maybe hundreds, repeated the same 3 lines, the same phrasing, the same punctuation, the same hand. By the time he reached the final page, his pulse was hammering. There, at the bottom, was a new entry. A 4th line added in fresh ink, still glistening under the lantern's glow. "You're late." He stepped back so fast that the floorboard creaked beneath him. "No," he whispered. "That's not—" But the pen lay beside the notebook. The cap was off, the tip still wet. He stared at it, the air thick around him, the silence now heavy enough to feel. Somewhere outside, something creaked. Not wind, not animal. Just a long, slow bending of wood. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, thumb shaking over the transmit button. Before he could press it, the device clicked by itself. The lantern flickered once. A voice came. Me through the static, calm, steady, and familiar. "Keep counting." Evan froze. The voice was his, not just similar, identical. Same tone, same breath at the start of each word. He stepped closer to the radio, disbelief breaking into panic. "Who is this?" The voice answered immediately, matching him perfectly. "Who is this?" He turned the volume down, but the sound didn't fade. The voice was inside the room now, faint, whispering from the walls, repeating his own words out of sync by half a second. He spun toward the table. The notebook had turned open again. The ink from the last line, "You're late," was spreading, the letters bleeding into the paper until they formed new words, shaky but legible. "Keep counting." The lantern flared, its flame brightening just enough to cast a second shadow beside him, a silhouette that mirrored his posture exactly, even when he didn't move. He backed toward the door. The radio clicked once more, the same calm tone whispering in his ear as the shadow turned its head toward him. "Marker 397, it said, voice steady. "You missed one." Evan burst out of the cabin and into the grey morning light, lungs burning, the echo of that voice still rattling inside his skull. The forest was breathing again, windless but alive, every leaf trembling with unseen rhythm. Behind him, the cabin's lantern flickered once and went out. He didn't look back. He ran. The trail that had led him here was still visible through the fog, the familiar orange markers glowing faintly against the tree trunks. But something was wrong. The sequence was reversed. 7. 196. 195. He slowed, heart thundering. Each number descended as he moved forward, counting backward through the forest. The direction was right. He was heading downhill toward the ranger station, but the count felt wrong against nature. "Just the paint running," he muttered to himself, though his voice shook. "Just moisture, corrosion." But the marks were too clean, too deliberate. The forest was rewriting itself again, line by line, undoing his path. He pressed on, trying to outpace the creeping wrongness. The air was thick, damp, heavy with the smell of wet bark and paint thinner. Each tree he passed bore a number smaller than the last, glowing faintly as though freshly written. 130 feet 3, 112, 97. He stumbled once on a root, catching himself with his palms in the mud. For a moment, his vision swam, and the numbers seemed to move, sliding down the trunks like liquid symbols, each one melting into the next. He blinked, and they were solid again. The sound of the brush returned, faint and steady, somewhere just out of sight. One stroke at a time. Careful, patient. He forced himself to keep walking, faster now. The forest narrowed, pressing in close, trunks crowding the path. He could see the descending numbers pulsing ahead of him, leading the way like a reverse heartbeat. 025, 013, 007. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could almost see the clearing through the fog now. The spot where the original trail began, where he'd painted the very first mark days ago. He slowed at the final tree. Its trunk was pale grey under the layer of peeled bark. The spot where 001 should have been painted was bare, clean, smooth, untouched. No orange paint. Instead, something darker caught the light. Grooves carved deep beneath the surface. He stepped closer. The letters were faint, weathered by time, half filled with moss. E. Rusk. His name, not fresh, not new. The cuts were old, years old. Evan staggered back, every inch of his body cold. He glanced around the clearing. The fog had thinned slightly, and he could see faint outlines of a structure beyond the trees. His ranger cabin, or something shaped like it, half buried in the brush, its windows shattered and roof sunken with age. He stared at it, unblinking. The trail wound straight toward its door, but every step closer made the air thicker, heavier, as if the forest didn't want him to leave. Behind him, the brush sound returned, one final stroke, slow and deliberate. He turned. The nearest tree, the one with his initials, now bore fresh paint again, the same orange glow, used. The sequence had completed itself, and somewhere in the distance, his own voice whispered through the fog, "Start over." The trail spat Evan out near dusk. Cold, mud-streaked, shaking from exhaustion. The fog thinned just enough for him to see the outline of his outpost through the trees. His relief was immediate, physical. The cabin looked the same as when he'd left it. Same dented stovepipe, same crooked radio antenna. For a moment he let himself believe the nightmare was behind him. But when he stepped inside, he knew it wasn't. The air smelled of wet paint. His field log sat on the desk where he'd left it, but the cover was sealed shut. Edges fused together by a thin layer of hardened orange paint. The brush lay beside it, bristles stiff, as if freshly used. He hadn't touched it since the day before. Evan tried to pry the book open. The cover wouldn't budge. When he pulled harder, the spine cracked and something inside shifted. A faint scraping sound, like pages moving on their own. He dropped it instinctively, stumbling back. The sound stopped. He turned to the radio, desperate for a familiar voice. The moment he touched the power switch, it came alive. No static this time, just clear, steady transmission. "Field report. Trail 19 complete. Proceed to next section." The voice was his. Calm, measured, professional. It even had his breathing pattern between phrases. Evan stared at the speaker, frozen. "Who is this?" The voice continued, unbothered. "All markers verified. Log sealed. Awaiting tomorrow's count." He yanked the cable from the wall. The radio kept talking. his pulse hammered. He grabbed his GPS from the desk. Maybe the coordinates could tell him what was happening. The screen blinked awake, briefly showing the old trail map. Then a new waypoint appeared, one that didn't exist before. Latitude 489936, longitude 121.9. He recognized the numbers immediately. The cabin. The waypoint label flickered once, then updated itself automatically. Next section. He tried to delete it. The cursor moved, but the button did nothing. A faint error tone pinged each time, followed by a quiet whisper under the electronics hum. A voice repeating the same line. Tomorrow's count begins at 1. Evan's hands trembled. He turned off the GPS. The screen stayed lit. He shut the power breaker to the whole cabin. The radio clicked back on. Field log received, the voice said. Counting resumes at dawn. He backed away from the desk. The sealed notebook was upright now, standing on its spine like it had been placed that way. Slowly it creaked open, splitting through the dried layer of paint without effort. The pen on the table rolled once, stopped, then lifted. Not floated, but moved, like guided by an invisible hand pressing from beneath. The nib touched the paper. Scratching began. Evan stared as words formed across the page in his own handwriting, neat and precise. Trail 19. Complete. Begin new record. The pen hesitated, then wrote another line. Slower this time. Deliberate. Tomorrow's count begins at 1, and then beneath it, one more. The ink still wet, the letters trembling. Welcome back, Ranger Rusk. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. The forest that counts. What do you think really happened out there? Was the forest using Evan to finish something ancient, or did he become part of its pattern forever? Let me know your theory in the comments. I always love reading what you think after each story. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We post new horror stories every week. Until next time, sleep well, if the forest lets you.